And the thing, of course, that you'll notice is that these walls are only showing their thickness, the outermost thickness of the walls, and none of the internal construction. Now, these are brick walls that have a masonry backup and insulation and so on. And so there's a variety of different layers of material in these walls. We're not seeing any of that in the current view. So this is the first thing I want to talk about, levels of detail. This is a view level setting that you can apply to each view, and it controls the display of elements like walls and floors and roofs and so on. But we're looking at walls here. And it's this little pop-up menu right here down on the bottom of the screen. So this is the view control bar, and the second icon over controls the level of detail. Coarse is what we're seeing right now. That will only show the outermost thickness of that assembly. So regardless of how many layers of material are in that wall thickness, we're only seeing its full outer dimension. If you change to either medium or fine, then you're going to see all that internal layer structure. Now, in the case of walls, it doesn't matter whether you choose medium or fine, you're going to see the same thing. But notice that when I do, I'm now seeing lots of different materials. So there's some drywall, there's concrete masonry units, there's insulation, there's an air gap, there's brick. However, you might notice that it's a little strange because the brick and the drywall seem to be on the wrong sides of the building, but we'll get into that in just a few moments. Before I switch to that though, let's talk about the line weights as they're displayed in this view. On my screen, you should be seeing that the outermost edge of the wall is a little bit bolder than the line work used to portray the inner layers. If you're not seeing that on your screen, if your screen looks more like this, then you've got something called thin lines turned on. And thin lines is persistent. Once you turn it on, it stays turned on until you turn it off. Now, I don't recommend that you have thin lines turned on for this video. In fact, I don't recommend that you have it turned on for this course. I'll tell you when to turn it on later in the course as a diagnostic tool. But for right now, I think it's going to display things much nicer if you leave thin lines turned off. Now, it's a matter of personal preference. If you prefer to have thin lines on, that's your choice. But I just wanted you to see the difference of what it would look like between the two. And certainly for this video, I think it will look a lot nicer if you leave the thin lines off. So anyway, that's what we're seeing here. So let's switch views. Let's go down to the floor plan wall types view next here. And in this view, we're seeing the full structure now, all four walls, and we're also seeing some dimensions. And I've also added some simple blue lines here that represent some of the concepts that I want to talk about. Now, these are just simple drafted lines. They're not part of the wall, but they will serve the purpose of illustrating the concepts that I want you to see here, okay? Let's start with this wall up here. We already mentioned that the brick is on the wrong side of the wall. Now, it would be a little strange to have the brick on the inside of the building and the drywall on the outside, so we should probably address that. Well, all you need to do is flip the orientation of the wall, and you can actually do that with this little control right here. When I do, that's exactly what it will do. The drywall is now on the bottom side of the wall, the brick's on the top side of the wall, but of course it only affected that one wall that I flipped. Each wall has its own orientation. That worked well because of a feature called location line. And the location line of that selected wall was right here along this dashed blue line. In other words, right along the center of the wall's geometry. So if you flip the wall along its center line, it flips in place and the dimensions of your building are unaffected. Well, let's contrast that to the behavior of this wall, which I intentionally set the location line to something else. So you'll notice that there's these two little grip controls at the ends of the wall there. And if I flip the orientation of this wall, notice that it now favors that inside edge of the wall instead when it flips. It had an impact on the overall dimension. So the building used to be 28 feet long. It's now 26 and some change. Okay, so it's gotten smaller. And it also had an impact on the way that the other two horizontal walls connect into it. So it was a more dramatic change. Now, that turns out that's not what I wanted because you can see the blue line here has been left behind and I really intended for it to stay over there. So let's undo that. And how would we do that differently? So location line is the feature that controls this. And it's not so much that there's a preferred location line, it's just a matter of sequence and strategy. any location line is fine. And in fact, there are 6 of them available in Revit. So before we talk about what the strategy is to this wall, let's talk about the 6 location lines. So I'm going to jump to our last view here called section location lines. And you can see a little section cut of the wall. And I've gone ahead and highlighted the concrete masonry unit portion of the wall in this green color because that's what is considered the core of the wall. And what you'll notice is that there are 6 possible location line settings. Now, some are self-explanatory. Things like finish face interior, finish face exterior are just the outermost and the innermost faces of the wall. Wall center line is also fairly self-explanatory. That's literally the geometric center of the wall. But then if you consider the core, the green shaded area, you also have an inside face, an outside face, and a center line. So that's your 6 possible combinations. So I'm going to go ahead and close this view. That was just for information. And we can take any wall, I'll select this one, and using the location line dropdown here, we can choose any one of those 6 possibilities. Now, the reason you do that is twofold. You do it before changing the wall's orientation, because as we saw a moment ago, the wall behaved a little bit unexpectedly when we flipped it when it had the wrong location line. Or you might also do that in a second scenario, which we'll look at next, which is changing the thickness of the wall. But let's start with this first scenario of changing the orientation. What we want to do is to get it to behave like this wall up at the top. So we're going to change it to wall center line first. That moves those little grip controls. Now I can change its orientation. It will flip in place. The overall location still matches this blue detail line. The dimensions are unchanged, 18 by 28. Now, if I wanted it to have finish face interior or finish face exterior, I could make that change after the fact and the wall won't shift. So you can have any location line you want, but just keep in mind that when you flip the orientation of the wall, it will flip around that location line. So it does matter that you choose the appropriate one for whatever behavior you want the wall to have. Now, keep in mind, you can always select a wall and move it later, okay? There's nothing preventing you from doing that. So if you accidentally have the wrong location line set, it's not a big deal. You can just move it back to where it needs to be. But if you want to control it without having to do the extra move, then think about your location line first, okay? Now, you'll probably notice I have some different dimensions on screen here. And I did that just as a way to illustrate that sometimes folks misinterpret the value or the function of the location line. The location line does not control dimensioning in any way. In fact, if you look at this dimension string here, you can see that we're able to dimension every single layer of the wall independently, regardless of location line. So location line has nothing to do with dimensioning. It has everything to do with either what I just showed you, changing the orientation, or let's look at one other option, changing the thickness of the wall. Now, thickness of the wall is not a property that's available here on the properties palette. The thickness of the wall is controlled by the type of wall that you assign to it. Okay, so in this case, the exterior brick on CMU wall is controlling how thick that wall is. But if I open up the type selector, there are other choices available, such as this one, generic brick, which is significantly thinner. When I choose that, you will see the wall becomes thinner, but notice that once again, it has left this little blue line behind. That's the face that I had wanted it to maintain. It didn't do that. Why? Well, once again, it has to do with location line. So let me undo that. Select this wall. Now, first of all, we should probably fix the orientation, right? So let's do that first. Then I want to maintain that outermost face now. So I'm going to do location line, finish face exterior. Then when I change this to generic brick, it will shift in place, and notice that it will maintain that outside face. So that's the key, right? So you're thinking about the location line in those 2 scenarios, when you're changing the wall's orientation or when you're changing its thickness. There really isn't any other time that you need to be concerned about it, okay? So let me flip this last one, and then now let's direct our attention to type-based properties. So exactly what do I mean by type-based properties? Well, let's go ahead and do a quick demonstration here. You can select any one of these 3 masonry walls, so it doesn't matter which one. And I'm going to instead go to the Edit Type button this time, instead of trying to find the properties I want directly on the Properties palette. Now, when you get to the edit type window, it will look something like this. It may or may not be showing a preview over here. So there's a preview button down at the bottom that controls that. So let's go ahead and turn that on. I think that's helpful. And then I'm going to click this edit structure button right here. And if this is all compressed and hard to read, you can just sort of stretch this to make it a little bit more legible. So let's make a change that will be immediately obvious on screen. The first layer is selected here. It's called finished masonry. I'm going to delete it. And then I'm going to keep doing that, delete, delete, delete for the 4 exterior layers on the exterior side of the wall. I'm going to leave everything else. Okay, so your preview should look like this, and let's click OK. Now, I'm going to get a couple warnings here because I had previously dimensioned those layers that I was deleting. So let's remove the references on those dimensions and let's click OK here to say that we're fine, that the overrides don't apply anymore. Trust me, both of those are perfectly fine. And then let's click OK one more time. And this is what I want you to see. Notice that the change has applied to all 3 of the walls, regardless of the fact that I only had 1 wall selected. Now that's pretty dramatic. So you want to make sure in your own projects that that's what you intended to do. So one failsafe that you can do to help you in a situation like that is, instead of doing it the way I did, where you just sort of plow in there and you change an existing type, what we can do is undo that. Let's click that again. There we go. So click undo twice there, it looks like. Select the wall, and then this is the more standard best practice way to do it. Go to edit type, duplicate the wall first, and give it a unique name. So I'm just going to call this exterior CMU, remove the 2 on the end there, click OK. I'll click edit structure, make it a little wider again, and I'm going to repeat the same process. I'm going to remove those 4 exterior layers. Looks good, click OK again. I'll get the remove references and the OK, and it's talking about this dimension right here. Okay, so it just didn't make sense anymore because it was trying to dimension layers that no longer existed. Notice that the change only applied to this 1 wall. The difference is that now I can select these 2 walls and go to the type selector here, and my new wall type exists on the list, and I can choose it, and you'll see it applies to the other instances. The reason that's considered more of a best practice is we've preserved the original, which is this one right here. And so we now have both wall types available to us, and you could apply them as needed throughout your model, and it's a little bit less destructive, right? So I'm not saying you will never edit a type directly and make the change directly, but more often than not, you're going to do edit type duplicate first. But what's important for you to understand in this video isn't so much whether or not you edit the type and duplicate it or not duplicate it. It's that you understand the difference between instance and type-based properties. Instance-based properties, you have to select the object and interact directly on the properties palette. Type-based properties, you go to edit type, and it will potentially apply to multiple instances throughout the model, unless, of course, you do the duplicate first. In this video, we're going to talk about snap behavior. There are 2 kinds of snapping that we have in Revit. We have increment snapping and we have object snapping. And so I'd like to illustrate both of those. And both of them are similar in a function. They help you build your model with more precision without necessarily having to input exact values in order to do so. So let's start with increment snapping. Stay zoomed out for this because what I want to do is show you kind of a built-in behavior that we benefit from when we're just simply drawing things like, it really works with any geometry, but you're really going to see it with things like walls and lines when you're drawing those. So I'm going to start the wall command and just click anywhere to start drawing the wall. And then I'm going to slowly start moving over to the side here. So you're going to see a dimension appearing there on the screen. And notice that if I move slowly, the increment that that dimension is changing in is a fixed increment. So in my case, it's every 6 inches. Okay. Now I'm going to roll the wheel down a few clicks to zoom out. And you'll notice that that has an impact on that snap increment. So now you'll see that the increment has changed to every 4 feet. Now the increments are slightly different in the metric file, but you should witness the same behavior. The further out you're zoomed, it will use a much coarser increment, and the closer in you zoom, it'll use a much more detailed increment. So if I zoom the other way, and let's zoom in here close enough to begin seeing it. There you go. At that point now, notice that I'm getting every inch. And if I keep going even closer still, eventually it's going to get down to the quarter of an inch. And in the metric file, I believe it gets down to the millimeter or possibly even finer than that. So just zoom in and out to see this behavior. You don't even need to click and create the wall. You're just simply watching it on screen there. Now, the other benefit of this snapping behavior is if I see a value of 3'3" there, I can trust that value. So I'm going to click to place that wall. I'm going to double escape to get out of the command. I'm going to come back and click this little measure tool up here on the quick access toolbar. Think of this as like a tape measure. And then I'm going to click right here at the end of that wall and then over here at the end of that wall. And you'll see that it's exactly 3'3" or whatever increment you set it to. So when you use that increment snapping behavior, it is accurate. Okay, so you can trust it. So that is one way that you could draw with precision. Now, the other thing I should point out is we just saw our first example of object snaps when I measured this object. That little purple square there at either end, those are object snaps. And that's how I knew I was snapping exactly to the endpoints of that wall. Now, I'm going to zoom out a little bit more here and I'll go back to the wall command again. And we also have increment snaps for angles. So if you kind of watch the angles here, notice that I'm never getting fractional angles. Even though it's going to 2 decimal places, those 2 decimal places are always zeros because the default increment is every 1 degree. However, there are also some built-in angles which are useful to us. 45 degrees, 90 degrees, horizontal and vertical, right? So you can snap to any of those preset increments just simply by clicking when you see that little indicator on screen, or knowing that even if you're going at some random angle, you're never at a fractional degree, you're always at a whole degree increment, right? So those are the increment snaps. So those are kind of nice because if you set them to a value that you want as sort of your minimal, then you know that even if you eyeball something, it's going to be within that tolerance. Now, the last thing I want to talk about with increment snaps is if I start here and I'm moving along and you can see that it's giving me the fixed increments. Notice what happened though when it senses other geometry. So it will always try to snap to other geometry. And notice that that just goes down to this really fine fractional increment the minute I did that, right? So if I come over here a little further, right, go back right there, right? It goes really fine and then really fine, or the same thing over here, really fine. So the increment snaps only apply when there's nothing else nearby that's more precise. So that's why I want you to think of it as kind of like the benchmark. That's sort of like the underlying minimum, but you can always snap with exact precision. If I wanted to line up with this wall precisely, I know I can do that because Revit's always on the lookout for those alignments. Okay, now this little assembly that I have down here is just for you to practice object snaps, and there are several of them. So I've already shown you endpoints, right? They use that little square symbol. You can also do midpoints. That's that little triangle symbol. You can also do tangent relationships. You can do quadrant relationships. You can do intersections. Intersections is like this little X right here. So you can see how it's doing the apparent intersection between the circle and the straight line. When you click, it is precisely snapped to that location. Okay, and there are a bunch of these. If you wanted to snap to the center of this circle, you can start right here on the circle itself, and then either right click, go to snap overrides and choose centers. And then it will find the center of that arc, and I'm starting right there. Or another way to get to that same thing is to use keyboard shortcuts. SC is snap to center, and it will snap right to that. Now, I've got a view over here called Snap Symbol Legend. And to do that, that's on the Manage tab. And you're going to be looking for the Snaps command, which is right here. And when you click that, the increments for linear dimensions are here. The increments for angular dimensions are here. All the object snaps are in the middle, including their keyboard shortcuts. If for some reason you don't want it to look for certain snaps, you can uncheck them. So if I didn't want it to look for tangents or I didn't want it to look for perpendiculars, you can uncheck those. I typically don't. I typically leave everything turned on, but that is an option that you have available. There are also some specialized snaps. And the last one that I want to show you is this one right here, snap mid between 2 points. So I'm going to cancel out of here. And then I'm going to start drawing a wall. And I want to start kind of right here in the middle between these two walls here. So you can either right click, snap overrides, snap mid between 2 points, or you can use the keyboard shortcut, which is S2. Either one. Pick your first point and your second point, and notice that it's going to automatically figure out where the midpoint is between those two clicks. And then I've drawn a wall that's halfway between those. Okay. So if you'd like to experiment further in this file, feel free to do so. You can try each of the object snaps, try changing the increment snaps, and just get a general feel for how the snap behavior functions. When you're getting ready to begin certain modeling tasks, it can sometimes be really helpful to have a dedicated view just for the purpose of getting your modeling task done. We often refer to these as working views. Now, the template we use to start with already contains some working views. So rather than start completely from scratch, we're going to repurpose the one that's already there. So we are here on the project browser, floor plans, architectural plan, but if you look a little bit further down here in the coordination branch, you will see floor plans working plan. If you expand that, there is a L1 and L2 working view. So we're going to do L1, the level 1 floor plan here, and I'm going to zoom in near the geometry. Now you can see that the walls are showing here and they're showing their layered assembly structure. And if you watched an earlier video where we talked about that, you know what that represents. You know, there's the brick and the drywall and so forth. And I don't think for the purposes that we're going to be doing here in this layout task, it's going to really require any of that. So the first thing we're going to do is come down here to the view control bar, and we're going to set the display level here to coarse. Now, again, from that earlier video, you may remember that when you go to coarse level of detail, it hides all of that internal geometry. That just makes things a little bit simpler for us to work on. Now, the next thing I want to do is just keep it focused on this small area here. So if we zoom back out a little bit, what we can do is we can hide anything that's not pertinent to the task at hand. That includes these dashed boxes out here, which are scope boxes, this dashed line, which is a reference plane, these elevation and section symbols. And what you can do is just kind of start out here outside the model, click and drag until you're crossing through all of that geometry like so. Now, I want to hide not only the stuff I have selected, but anything that's like it. So we can do that by coming down here to this little pop-up on the view control bar. It's the temporary hide isolate pop-up, and there's a few different options, and one of them is hide category. If you choose hide category, it hides not only the things you selected, but everything else in that category, and therefore it achieves exactly what I was looking for. Now, if you right-click anywhere and go to zoom to fit, it will zoom in nice and close on just our building geometry. And this is exactly what I was looking for. Just a nice, clean working view that shows me the outline of the building, and I can focus on doing that internal layout task. Now, the trouble is this is temporary hide isolate, as indicated by this little label here in the upper corner. If I were to save this file, close it, and reopen it tomorrow, all of that stuff would come back again. So what I want to do is make that hidden geometry permanent in this view. So we can go right back to that little pop-up and choose Apply Hide Isolate to the view. And the label disappears, but notice that it's still all hidden. We now have that nice clean view, and that's really all there is to it. Now, there's lots of other things you can do in a working view. This is not an exhaustive list by any chance, but I've specifically designed what I've chosen to do in this working view based on the task that I intend to use it for, which means that in the future, you might very well create multiple working views for different purposes. If you find yourself in that situation, simply right-click the view and you can go to this duplicate option and create another copy that you set up another way. So you could create one for laying out walls and another one for configuring the ceilings and another one for calculating areas and square footages, whatever you want. Okay, so you can have as many views as is necessary in order to help you perform the task at hand. In either file, the next thing you want to do is start moving your mouse near the center line of this top wall here. And you'll notice a dimension will either appear going to the wall at the left or the wall at the right, depending on which one you're closer to. So it doesn't really matter where exactly you place this wall, but just so that it's kind of favoring the wall on the right there, you can click that first start point and you want to start moving your mouse down. Now, as we've already seen in earlier videos, you can draw this wall at any angle you like, but it should snap nicely to standard angles like 90 and 45 and so forth. So what we want to do is pull it straight down at a 90-degree, click somewhere, and then turn the corner also at 90 degrees, and then come again and click into the center line of this exterior wall over here. Now, when you do, that should give you this little boxed out corner there, and it should break the chain. Now, what do you do if it didn't break the chain? Let me show you that again. I'm going to start maybe right about here this time, and I'm going to come over to about that location, click a point, pull it straight down, but this time I'm going to stop at the face of the exterior wall and click, and you might have witnessed this with the earlier wall. So what happened in that case is because I didn't go to the center line, it just defaults to continuing the chain. Now, it's no big deal. We've talked about chain before in a previous video. You can simply press the escape key one time, and that will break the chain, and then you can continue. So what we want to do is add another small space up here. So at the top of the plan, we're going to have a bedroom with a small toilet room next to it. We're going to have a walk-in closet right here, and then another toilet room here. And then for this bedroom down at the corner, we're just going to do a little L-shaped wall there to create a closet. Now, you'll notice that I didn't pay any attention to the exact positions of where I placed those walls. That was deliberate. This is the sketch part of the process. Your job is to just roughly get those walls in their approximate locations. Then we're going to click the Modify tool to cancel out of the Wall tool and move on to the Modify part. So remember, the process is sketch, then modify. So how do we do that? Well, now we're going to fine-tune the positions of all of these walls to meet our design needs. So I'm going to start with this wall right here, and you simply want to select it. And when you do, you should see some temporary dimensions appear on the left and the right. Now, we've encountered temporary dimensions before, but they're a very common tool, so it's worth repeating some of the basics here. The most important thing when working with temporary dimensions is making sure that you're clicking the number and not this little symbol down below it. If you click that, notice the tooltip says it's going to make that temporary dimension permanent. And if I click away from that wall, I now have a dimension there. Now that's useful, and in some cases that may be what you want, but that's not what we want right here. So I'm going to select this dimension, press the delete key, and then try again. I'm going to pick this wall, and what I want to do instead is click right on that numerical value instead. That will activate it as a piece of editable text, and now I will type in the value I want. Now, if you're working in the imperial file, you want 8 foot 1 inches, and again, you can either do 8 foot symbol 1 or 8 space 1. If you're working in the metric file, put in 2575. 2,575 millimeters. Notice that that will move the wall over to the right. Now, the next thing I want to do is set the size of the toilet room next to it. Here's a very common mistake. Folks say, well, I got a dimension right there. Let me just go ahead and edit that. And I'll put in 5 in the imperial file or 1525 in the metric file. And notice that the same wall moves back to in the other direction. That's because I had that wall selected. So let me do Control Z once to undo. And the most important thing to keep in mind about temporary dimensions is what you have selected is what will move. So it wasn't this wall that I wanted to move a second time, it was this one. So notice that when I pick that second wall, I get a new set of temporary dimensions. Now, another thing that I wanted to point out about temporary dimensions that you may have noticed on your own is they're kind of immune to zooming. So right now, it's a little difficult to read the number that's right here on the one on the left on my screen. So you might be tempted to zoom in and get a better look. But notice what happens when you zoom in. The size of the dimension text is unchanged, it just kind of continues to be the same pixel size on screen. So that's something you're just going to have to get used to with temporary dimensions. There's no way to zoom in or out on that text. It will always be a consistent size. Now, it is possible to go to the File menu, go to Options, and there's a setting under Temporary Dimensions in Options that allows you to change the size of that text. But again, it's a fixed size that will stay consistent as you zoom in or out. Okay, I'm going to leave mine the way it is because I'm content with the size of the text as it is, but I just wanted to show you that strange little anomaly there. So let me edit this value, the one on the left here, and in the imperial file, I'm going to make that 5. If you're working in metric, go with 1525. And let me zoom back out so I can see the whole plan here. Okay, so now I'm going to direct my attention to this wall. Now this wall is a little bit different because as you'll notice, as you move that wall, it stays connected to all of these other walls and they all shape and resize along with it. So that's why this sketch but modify approach is so effective, because simply moving a couple walls can have an impact on the majority of the layout in a floor plan. So it's a very powerful way to work. So let's select this wall. And I'm going to use this top value here. And in the imperial file, I want it to be 10. In the metric file, that's 3000. So next, I'm going to move over to this closet, and I want the value here to be 5'3" in imperial or 1550 if you're working in metric. Again, remember to change selection to set the size of the bathroom. That's 5 foot imperial or 1525 in metric. Next, I'm going to direct my attention to this closet. So let's start with this small wall at the top here of the closet. It's a little bit too close to the wall above it. Now, we could type in this value right here if we knew what that distance is, but what I actually know is the distance from the exterior wall to the top surface of this wall. So you may recall that we've got these little grip controls on our temporary dimensions, and those can actually be moved around. Okay, so what I'm going to do is simply click that little dot, and you see how it jumps from the inside face to the middle. If I click it again, it jumps to the outside face. Now, if I click it one more time, it goes back to the inside. So each time you click, it jumps to a new location. So when it's at the location you want, you can then edit the value. And this is going to be 8'2" in imperial or 2500 in metric. And then I'll select this wall. And using that same technique, I can adjust that witness line to do the size of the closet. Now, in this case, as I've already indicated, if I zoom in, it doesn't increase the size of the text, but it might allow me to see the witness lines a little bit cleaner. So I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't ever zoom. I'm just simply saying that it won't affect the size of the text. But let's go ahead and click this one, and then again, and then this is 2'8". And then I'll zoom back out. And now I need to set the size of this bedroom here. The trouble is, all of this is already sized correctly. This is all the correct size relative to each other. But I want to move them all together. But notice that when I make a selection of multiple objects, I'm not seeing any temporary dimensions. Well, it turns out that there's a button right here called Activate Controls and Dimensions. Yours might have been on already. This is a persistent control. So once you click it, it stays on until you turn it off. So just make sure that that's on. So I've done that. And now I get dimensions for that entire selection. Now here's the thing. None of these is what I want to use. So notice that little grip control. And we've already talked about how you can click it and it will jump from center to face to face. Well, what we can also do is drag it. So I'm going to pick it up and drag it and then drop it onto the outside face right here. And that's the number I want to change. That is 12'7" in imperial or 3775 if you're working in metric. And that completes our basic layout of at least the left-hand side of our 2-bedroom condominium unit there. I'm going to select this wall right here. And then if I press either enter or space, that completes the selection and then moves me on to the next step of the command. The next step of the command is how far and in what direction you want to move it. So there's a number of ways you could do that. You could click points on screen, you can type in values, you can even use existing geometry to kind of set that distance. So let's say that I wanted to move this wall a distance that was equal to the width of this closet. So I could snap right to this endpoint right here, kind of drag over to this endpoint here and click again, And notice that it moves that wall. And of course, because it was connected to another wall, that other wall stays connected. Now that makes for a really narrow space there to the left. So perhaps I moved that a little bit too far. So I'm going to keep the wall selected, go right back to move. This time it goes right to the second step of the move command, which is basically saying how far and where do you want to go, because it will assume that I'm trying to move the element I already had selected. So you can do the selection either way. I actually prefer this way. I like to make the selection first. I think that's a little bit more convenient, but it really is up to you which method you use. Now, this time I'm going to pick my start point right on the wall itself. I'm going to start moving horizontally to the right. And then as an alternative, you can type in your distance. So if I'm working in imperial, I'll type in 3 for 3 feet. If you're working in metric, you can do 900 millimeters. And you'll see that wall move over and reshape the spaces. Okay, so that's the real basics of the move command. Now I'm going to keep that wall selected and move to the copy command next, which is very similar to the move command. In fact, most of the prompts are the same. The only difference is instead of moving the original object, we're making a copy of it. And what I'm going to do is pick a start point. And this time I'm just simply going to eyeball the second point to create a copy of that wall right next to the first one. Now, look at my options bar and you'll see some checkboxes. And notice that I've got a checkbox in the multiple option. So what that means is that I'm actually in multiple copy mode, which means that if I came somewhere else and clicked and clicked and clicked, I'm creating multiple copies of that object. You can make as many as you want. When you're done making copies, you can either press escape twice or click the modify tool to cancel. Now I don't really need these walls over here, so I'm going to just select all 3 of them and press the delete key to get rid of them. There's also the delete command right here, this little red X. So either one does the same thing. Okay, so that's one of the options that's on the options bar. And the thing to be aware of with the options for these commands is they remain persistent. So the reason multiple was already turned on for me is because the last time I used the copy command, I checked the multiple option and Revit remembers that. The same is going to be true for the other commands. So for example, let's see what happens if we go back to this newly copied wall and try to move it. So I'm going to go to the move command and I'm going to try and move it down a little bit. Well, notice that it does sort of move it down, but it left it connected to the wall up above, okay? Because by default, that's the way the move command behaves. Well, if you go back to move, there's an option on the options bar called disjoint. If I check that, now what happens is if I pick the wall up and move it to a new location, it will disconnect itself from the previous wall. Now, the only thing I want to caution you on here is disjoin is a very specialized feature and it's useful in this situation, but a lot of times it can cause you a little bit of grief. So what I recommend that you do is go right back to the move command, uncheck disjoin, and then click the modify tool to cancel. This way, Revit will remember that disjoin was unchecked and that will avoid some problems going forward in the future. And you might want to get in the habit of just doing that with any of the options that you don't want to be persistent. So disjoin is one of the ones that I find is particularly problematic. Okay, so let's move on to the next command that I want to show you, which is this one right here, the trim and extend to corner. It's got a keyboard shortcut of TR. So if you prefer, you can type those letters. So I'm going to go to that command, and the first way that I'll demonstrate it is over here in this bedroom. I'm going to select the horizontal wall right about there, and then this vertical wall right here. And what you'll see that it does is it actually trims off the part of the wall past where I selected it. Now, looking at that, that's probably not what I wanted. So let me reverse that by simply selecting 2 different walls this time to reclose up that cavity. So the way that this command works is you simply touch 2 objects, and based on the way that you select them and their current configuration, it will either trim their lengths down or it will extend their lengths out. So here's an example of when it would do extend. If I select this wall and then this wall, you'll see a little dashed line indicator of what the result is going to be, and it will extend those 2 walls together until they meet at a point there. Now, if you look at the status bar, you'll see that it says select the first line or wall to trim, and then it says click on the part you want to keep. This is important because it matters which side you click on. So let me click this wall here, and then if I click the bottom portion of this vertical line, I get one thing, Control Z to undo. If I pick the top portion, I get something else entirely. Control Z to undo. So just keep that in mind when you're using the trim and extend to a corner, that when you're trimming, it matters what side you click. Now, it doesn't really matter when you're extending because the wall is always going to get longer. Now, I want to make a little corridor here coming into the unit, and I want to base it off of this diagonal wall right here. So let me go to the Modify tool to cancel, and I could do copy again, but there's another way to copy, and it's the Offset tool. So the keyboard shortcut is OF. I'll go ahead and click that. And then there are some options on the options bar. So the first option is how far do you want to offset? And you can put in any numerical value you want there. I'm going to put in 5 feet in imperial or 1500 millimeters if you're working in metric. Now, right next to that is a copy checkbox. I want to make sure that's turned on. Otherwise, it will move the object rather than copy it. And then the way that this works is you can highlight an object and then just simply move the mouse to determine which side you want the offset to occur. So I want to make sure that I'm highlighting this diagonal wall and then move slightly so that it's offsetting it down, and then I'll click and it copies that wall down to make that little corridor. I'll cancel out of the command. I'll come back to trim and extend to a corner. I'll pick the newly copied diagonal wall. And then, very important, remember not to click the top half of this wall. You want to click the lower half so that it creates the correct corner condition like so. Now, you'll see here that this wall is a little too short. If I did trim and extend to corner, I'm not going to get what I want there, so I'm going to undo that. So instead, I'm going to shift to this trim and extend command. This one is a little bit different because you pick a boundary edge first. That's what you want to extend or trim to, and then the element you want to trim and extend. And in this case, it won't create an L condition, it'll create a T condition, and that's more appropriate for this situation. So let's click the Modify tool to cancel out of there. I'm going to go to Architecture and click Wall, or you can type WA. I want to make sure I'm using the same wall type that we used for the other walls, and I'll just sort of box out a little pantry right here and a little utility room right here, and then I'll click the Modify tool to cancel. So the next thing that I want to do is create an opening in this location here. So you might be tempted to go to trim and extend again, but the trouble is, remember that it's going to trim the entire wall, and it's going to generate this warning here that says that it can't keep elements joined. So let me cancel that. So what we're going to do instead is use split element. SL is the shortcut. Now you can use this command in one of two ways depending on the setting of this delete inner segment checkbox. If it's unchecked, you can split at a point, then go to trim and extend and do the cleanup, and we could repeat it on the other side. Or if I undo twice, I can check the box, delete inner segment, and now I can simply click 2 points here, and it will trim out that little segment in between. And so at this point, there's some fine tuning to do. We can adjust the size of some of these rooms and manipulate some of these spaces a little bit further. And I welcome you to experiment more with the various modification tools that are in here and with the layout in general, just to get a little bit more practice in.